Thank you very much for joining our inaugural event of our new speaker series called Founders. And I am really thrilled to have as our very first speaker a UCLA law grad in the class of 2015, Kelly Orians. I'm not going to do a big introduction of Kelly because a lot of this program is going to be about how Kelly came to create her own venture. But I do want to say this. I met Kelly, I joined UCLA in 2014 or the end of 2013, and I met Kelly in my first year. We talked several times in the hallway. She came to my office a couple of times and talked. And then I had the privilege of sitting in on mock interviews for her for some fellowships that she was going to, that she had applied for. And I have to say that when I think about UCLA Law School, it's Kelly who comes to mind as being the very best of what UCLA Law produces in terms of her vision, her drive, her sort of thoughtfulness and thinking through things. So I was really thrilled when she accepted my invitation to do this. So Kelly, I wanted to start by just asking you to tell us about First 72 Plus and sort of tell us what its programs are, what you're trying to do with it. Go ahead and make your sales pitch. Because I think it's a fabulous program, a fabulous organization. I've donated to it on several occasions, and I just think it's wonderful. So go ahead and make your sales pitch.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So that's something I've spent a lot of time doing over the last few years. I categorize myself as a social entrepreneur, and as one, I have to focus on fundraising through pitch competitions quite a bit. I'm actually a little bit later on going to attack the concept of social entrepreneurship just a little bit. So I'm going to contradict myself, but I think that's okay. So the First 72 Plus is a holistic reentry services organization based in New Orleans, Louisiana. We were started by and for formerly incarcerated people. Today, over 90% of our staff are formerly incarcerated or the family members of formerly incarcerated people. So we operate by the credo of those closest to the problems or closest to the solution. And when you walk into our office, one of the first things you'll see is a big sign that says, "This is us helping us." And we came about in 2014 was when we opened up our first transitional house. We took an old bail bonds office actually and converted it into a free transitional house for formerly incarcerated people. And about a year and a half later, took the office where the bounty hunters for the old bail bonds office used to operate, had to switch our Wi-Fi password from fugitive to free the 504, exclamation point, exclamation point. And we started there. We started trying to meet the most basic need of people coming home from prison, which is to have a safe place to stay. And so from there, we essentially decided that with our first 6 residents, that we would build out the programming that was necessary to help them not just find independence and self-sufficiency, but to grow and thrive. And we really challenge the notion that success for people coming home from prison is simply a low-wage job and a rental apartment. And we try to leverage the incredible capacity that people have, an incredible commitment that people have to doing the right thing and to benefiting their communities to help them achieve so much more than that. So today, we, in addition to our emergency transitional housing program, we have a case management program. We have 2 case managers on staff. We have a team of what we call reentry coaches who provide peer support and reentry coaching. We have a free legal services clinic. And we have a division, which we call the Economic Empowerment Division, where we help people start small businesses. And we provide 0 interest loans to help them access capital and also build their credit. As I mentioned when I started, the cornerstone of everything that we do here is leveraging the empathic connection that formerly incarcerated people have with each other. To be able to empower them to lead the way. We do that both because it makes sense, and the people who have been through this process before are the most capable of guiding others, but also from a fairness and equity standpoint, that nonprofit organizations in the 501c3 sector bring in a lot of money and have quite a bit of power. And a little later, I made a note that I wanted to talk a little bit about what that looks like right now in terms of the domination of a lot of the nonprofit sector by well-intentioned white folks, but folks who are distanced from the problems that they've set out to solve. And one of our secondary goals in what we're doing is to try to close that gap and make these jobs accessible to communities that historically have not had the greatest access to them.
So I want to go back to that issue, but before I do, I want to ask you about what your vision is sort of for the future. I mean, typically when I talk to entrepreneurs, it's often in a for-profit context. And of course, the future is, well, we're going to go public or we're going to sell or something like that. Obviously, with social entrepreneurship, there are different avenues. But what do you see 5 years, 10 years? What would you like for 72 Plus to be?
Yeah, this is I want to be incredibly candid today with this group, because especially if there's anybody in this group who's considering pursuing something like developing a nonprofit or a for-profit mission-driven organization, that question of what scale is and what long-term impact is has been a weakness of ours to really define it. And we actually were a finalist for $1 million prize about 2.5 years ago now. And one of the things we could not answer, at least I'd say answer effectively enough, was where do we see ourselves? And I think we get challenged a lot in this space to say, well, we want to be the McDonald's of reentry organizations. We want to be ubiquitous, where our organization will be in every city in America. And while we want to see support for formerly incarcerated people be everywhere in the United States, which is the mass incarceration capital of the entire world, the cornerstone of what we do is that we're entirely community based. COVID has challenged that quite a bit, but we are very idiosyncratic to the space that we're in, because especially like a city like New Orleans, we're very unique, but every city is unique, right? New Orleans might be particularly unique. I get that, but every city has its uniquities. But to actually answer your question, we are running up against a system that has of halfway houses that are, and I really resist painting in broad brush strokes, but we largely, the halfway house system, both in Louisiana and the United States, is exploitative. It is abusive. It does not meet the needs of people who are incarcerated. It takes prison and it basically makes it like a Diet Coke version of prison, where you have no freedom to move. You have no freedom to actually take control of your own life, and it traps people in a vicious cycle. And so we would very much like to challenge that notion. And we've created several what we consider to be best practices. They have not been nationally accredited by any stretch, but best practices and models where formerly incarcerated people in communities all across the United States can take what we've learned in terms of both liability protection and the more administrative HR side of how you run a business like this, mixed with a keen understanding about what formerly incarcerated people are up against, especially in those first 72 hours, as our name evokes, and those first 5 years where recidivism is most likely, and are able to train people in communities across the United States to build their own version of the first 72 plus. Locally, we have a goal within 5 years to have at least 50 beds we have a model where we have a small transitional house with no more than 6 beds and room for 6 people who all have their, now because of COVID, we actually, instead of shared rooms, we have private rooms so that we can more quickly quarantine if somebody were to get sick. That's adjacent to an office where you have access during the weekday and after hours if necessary to get holistic wraparound services. And we want to expand that to have at least a capacity for at least 50 people across the greater New Orleans area as a goal for us. And we're in the process of building our second transitional house. But because of COVID, not to go too far into what might be another question about our reaction to COVID, we actually expedited this and moved from 6 beds in our initial house to we have 22 beds by taking advantage of Airbnbs not being in demand as much. And we were able to take 6 homes offline from landlords across New Orleans who were previously doing whole home rentals on Airbnb and have taken year-long leases on those properties.
So I want to ask you about COVID in a minute, but first I want to go back to sort of a bigger question. It seems to me that we're in a period of time in the United States, putting COVID aside, where we are seeing tremendous amount of potential for change in terms of racial justice, in terms of perhaps changing wealth inequalities, rethinking lots of different structures and institutions in the country, from the proper role of police to the appropriate role, if any, for prisons. So there's a wide variety of issues that, from my perspective at least, just as a citizen, in spite of the fact that there's obviously been tremendous trauma to bring this about, I feel slightly optimistic that we are actually having these conversations and thinking about these things. Mm-hmm. So I'd be interested to know how First 72 Plus plays into this conversation, because in some ways it seems to me you're almost at the center of it, or close to the center of it in some ways. And how has it affected First 72 Plus?
Yeah, it's I first certainly have to give credit to particularly women of color who have been beating this drum for decades and raising awareness about the fact that if incarceration worked as a tactic to deter, I saw Professor Dolovich on here, and sort of the purposes of incarceration, right? If deterrence were actually an outcome of incarceration, and to promote public safety, we would be the safest country in the world, and certainly the city of New Orleans would be the safest city in the country, in the world, and yet we're not. And so finally, over the last 6 months, I am optimistic as well. It's been incredible to see people on both sides of the aisle that are acknowledging that this system is not effective. And I think we've seen a rallying cry around the notion of defunding the police. We in our community, we talk more about reimagining public safety. It's not necessarily that we need to put less resources into public safety. We just need to direct those resources into actively effective solutions. So for us, we find ourselves being confronted with the exact same questions that people in the Department of Corrections, in the Department of Probation and Parole, in the police, and in the courts are tasked with answering. We provide housing to people, which also so do jailers, and so does the Department of Corrections. We provide supervision to people and accountability, as does the Department of Probation and Parole and the police. Yet we are reimagining what that relationship looks like, and it is not easy. Particularly because, and this is where I have to really credit I also had a specialization in critical race studies program, as we have been groomed and educated within a system dominated by notions of hierarchy and of white supremacy and of other notions and misogyny. We've been groomed with these notions. How do you reimagine what a system looks like if you've never been exposed to other systems that are doing it in a different way? And so we can fall very easily into a trap of just recreating the same structures that got us into this mess in the first place. And I find my job as an executive director is to broker these conversations with my colleagues and create space where we can truly reimagine it. And so right now we have 22 people, a combination of single men, single women, men with children, and women with children. We also we are not an organization that was developed to support, and this is a failure of ours, to support people who are gender non-conforming or LGBT. And over the last couple of months, we've confronted that on a couple of occasions for how we can be more intentional in that regard. The majority of our clients are cisgender. But we have 22 people who are living with us at any given time in a network of homes. We are responsible for feeding them, for setting rules and holding them accountable when they break rules or harm somebody else, for providing them a safe place to stay. And we have to, the hardest thing we have to confront is when somebody does something wrong to harm somebody else. Or to harm a member of our staff, and what does accountability look like in that space, and what does a process look like in that space? And that's both very daunting, but really exciting, because that's the question we're confronting, right? Nobody's denying that people are out there that will harm somebody else. The challenge for us is to ask why and what we're going to do about it, and how we're going to hold them accountable so that they don't harm somebody else in the future. And how can the person that's been harmed be in some way repaired or made whole again? Is that ever even possible? And we, as an organization that also we butt up against, philanthropy and the nonprofit, the complex of funding, which can sometimes can sometimes hit us in ways that force us to make decisions that run afoul of the decisions that we know are best for our mission. And my job as an executive director is to try to navigate that and protect our mission. It's really, really hard. But that's where we're at. And so on a practical level, what that has looked like is we recently expanded our base of clients from just people coming home from prison to a population of folks that I think for a long time have been ignored in the reentry landscape, which are people who are out on bond. One really interesting thing happening in New Orleans right now is we created a nonprofit alternative to the for-profit money bail system. And after years of attacking money bail as an ineffective strategy, and a strategy that preys upon communities of low-income communities of color through legislation and policy making in the courts, it turns out that creating a for-profit alternative was the most disastrous for the sector. Mm-hmm. They have lost a tremendous amount of business since that's happened. But what it has also demanded, and these are my colleagues who are people of color who have grown up in the communities to which people out on bond return, is cool. Jail, we know, is traumatizing. We know it's dangerous because of COVID. We know that we as a country resist infringements on our liberty. But what about the block where this person is coming back to? And what about the mental illness or the substance use disorder or the anger issues that this person has? What about that? What are we going to do? And because we could be abolitionists, but I also need to have an answer of what we're going to do to keep the community safe. And so now we're actually working with the Bond Fund to provide supports to people coming out of the jail system who are out on bond. And what that's looked like as well is having to confront what our public health system looks like with mental health, access to mental health services, and access to substance abuse treatment. And that we find ourselves at the center, almost operating like a Department of Public Safety, that we're obviously on a smaller scale, but we're that alternative to say, we know this system hasn't been working, so how can we make that look better? And on a day-to-day basis, that is our coaches and our team having systems in place that respond to needs as they occur, promote access to treatment as opposed to just access to bondage, and making sure that there are seamless processes in place to allow that to happen. I'm going to stop there. I could go on and on with anecdotes about the weeks that it takes someone who's dealing with who's diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. They get released from jail and they have to wait 3 weeks in order to get their medicine. And so they go 3 weeks without treatment during that time, at which point they start developing psychosis. And our job is to go in and shorten that 3 weeks to no time, so that there's a seamless transition and access to medicine. And I could go on and on with examples about that.
So I'm curious about, these are very, very complex problems. And even people with lots of experience and who are operating in good faith would find these problems, or do find these problems, daunting. How are you navigating this exactly? Because you have a lot of experience, but not that much yet. I mean, you've only been out of law school for 5 years. So how are you exactly navigating these kinds of issues and dealing with the city, the state, other organizations?
So I think the single most important lesson and guiding light that I live by every single day is listen to Black women. Before the first 72 plus came about, it was Black women that were doing this work in New Orleans. It was the mothers, the grandmothers, the daughters, the girlfriends, the mothers of children who were supporting largely Black men in our system. Despite making up only 30% of the population, Black men make over 80% of our incarcerated population. And those were the women tasked with keeping this responsible. And outside of the incarceration context, it was Black women in the community. It is Black women in the communities of New Orleans that keep their communities together and take care of people and try to keep them from ending up in this system. And so I actually think it's one of my fellowship programs was through Echoing Green. And I had another colleague who ran an organization that supported veterans, and he had zero experience with supporting veterans. And both of us bonded over the fact that it was that lack of a natural empathy from a shared experience, although my family has been impacted by incarceration, but it was that lack of experience combined with a deep commitment to listening that made us good leaders, I think, because I don't get out there saying I have the answer. I make sure that there is space for the people that have the answer are able to have their voices amplified. And then my role is to acknowledge that there's a very real power differential and gap for my colleagues that have the answers to get access to the power and resources to implement those answers. The last part of that notion of people closest to the problem or closest to the solution is they're furthest from the resources. And so as a licensed attorney, as a white woman, as a woman that I think I have a little bit of a gifted gab, I have some good public speaking skills. I'm really fascinated by administrative process, and I'm fascinated by, I loved civics class. I love under the separation of powers, how the executive branch functions, how the administrative agencies are tasked with carrying out this mandate. I have that institutional knowledge, and so I act as a navigator in hand with my colleagues that have the substantive answers to what this looks like.
So let me go back to COVID for a moment. So all of a sudden, it's not like you don't have enough issues to deal with. All of a sudden COVID arrives, right? Which has immediate impact both on your mission and on the fact that you have employees, right, you have to deal with it. So I'm interested in knowing how you dealt with it and what kind of resources were you able to bring to bear to the problem, because obviously lots of well-established institutions with lots of resources have really found it very, very difficult to deal with this problem.
Yes, yeah, we only shut down for half a day. On March 16th, our governor, we knew about 2 hours before our governor and our mayor came out that we were going to shut down, that this was going to happen. And we came together in our office and said, we're going to go home today. And everyone, as if you could do this in like 6 hours, but we said, get your house in order, figure out what's going on. We'll make a plan, and we'll have a staff meeting on Zoom at 9 o'clock in the morning. Unfortunately, one of the biggest, a benefit of COVID in some ways is that we brought so much attention to the digital divide in our country. Access to technology and technological literacy is not an option. It's not a choice. It's an absolute necessity. And access to wireless internet, water, you cannot function in our society without understanding how to use technology now more than ever. But that was an issue that hit our staff as well. And so one of our biggest struggles was to get our staff comfortable using technology. And so I took like a screenshot at that 9 a.m. after it took about 45 minutes for the entire staff to get on. Somebody managed to flip their screen upside down. One person, it was just like looking up at the ceiling and he couldn't figure out how to use the camera. Like 3 people were on one person's cell phone and he was holding it up to the microphone, but like we made it, we were all connected and we made it. And so that was why we've done well. And we're actually at the beginning of this fiscal year. I will say that I have some real regret at what that meant for my coworkers who were spread unbelievably thin. 2 of my coworkers are primary care providers for their grandchildren because their children are either in prison or deceased from violence. And 3 of my other coworkers are parents, and they have multiple kids, and all of their kids were out of school. And everybody had computers. Some of their kids were having to use their computers because their schools weren't giving them computers. And it really forced me to confront, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't realize this in the 6 years prior, that my biggest priority as an executive director, any leader of a company, is to protect our staff and to make sure that our staff are safe, that they're supported, And if we couldn't serve any formerly incarcerated people for months, really keeping our staff afloat and being able to make sure their salaries are paid and that they have health care was a victory. And a lot of our I got on the phone within the first 2 weeks and started to talk to a lot of our funders about that point, about right now keeping afloat 17 people who are parents and grandparents and primary care providers of children within our city, and who are also family members of people who are being unemployed. That's a victory right now. And so I was able to advocate to get some of our restricted budget allocated towards bonuses and other, we worked with our accountant to figure out a way for these not to be taxed so heavily, to add to everyone's paychecks so that they could fill that gap for their loved ones who had lost their jobs. Mm-hmm. And I started just focusing intensely on how to support my colleagues to feel safe and protected and supported. And I learned a lot about how to do that best. And what was a benefit of that towards our mission and like our fiduciary responsibility is that they were doing the best they'd ever done, because they felt supported in that way. And I took a step back from more of the day-to-day with clients, which I miss. But right now I consider my clients to be my coworkers, that I am responsible for them and I am responsible for making sure they can support their families. And what that looked like was we had a benefit that we have not had any turnover. We haven't had anybody that's had to leave. God forbid we had anybody get sick, and knock on wood, right now we have not. We did have a colleague get diagnosed with cancer in the middle of all of this, which was a lot, but we've been able to keep everyone safe, and now they're working at a more productive level, to put it, in those terms, than they ever have. And we had been doing this previously, but it's tough to teach computer skills on a computer. Right. And so, and we have not solved that yet, but we do have a really large space at a partner church where we can keep, and the climate in New Orleans is very mild. And so right now, at least. And so we're going back to in-person computer classes, and I pay 6 members of my staff are paid 8 hours out of every month just to work one-on-one with a computer skills instructor. And that's on their normal hours. Mm-hmm. And so that's hours where they're just investing in their own tech literacy. And we have actually, it's a son of one of our current residents whose father was in prison his entire life, who teaches that class to our staff members. And I think from like an HR perspective, which really all EDs need to embrace and need to think of themselves as sort of the supporter in chief of their staff, thinking about things are really crucial about what benefits packages look like and how we're investing in our staff. We similarly have a part of our benefits package where we have an attorney who provides free criminal defense on traffic tickets. Because as we know from the Stanford Open Policing Project, Black drivers are more likely disproportionately stopped, ticketed, searched, and arrested than white drivers. And so for our Black colleagues to be bearing that burden without any support seemed like a very irresponsible disregard for their lived reality. And so now we have an attorney on retainer, and we pay between $500 and $750 a month to provide legal representation on traffic tickets, so that we make sure that we have, and municipal tickets as well, to make sure that we have, everyone has a valid driver's license. And so it's big and small things like that to really pay attention to what the staff needs. And again, it required me to listen and understand lived realities that were just a blind spot to me.
So I want to move back a few years, right? You've just described for us sort of the kinds of challenges and issues you're facing right now. And I don't imagine 5-6 years ago, when you were starting this organization, that you could even have imagined that you would have to think about, how am I going to invest in, am I going to have employees, but how am I going to invest in employees and make sure they have computer skills, which not only does my organization need, but in fact will be good for them going forward in the future. So let's go back and sort of talk about the challenges that you faced just in starting this, right? Trying to put it together, which now must seem simple compared to what you're facing.
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't even think Kelly of 6 years ago would have listened to Kelly of today when I said, your biggest issue is not going to be fundraising. When I was working 3 jobs And I got an, just to be candid about money, I got an $80,000 fellowship to start the organization from Echoing Green, as well as supplemental from a public service fellowship I had at UCLA, and I kept about 30,000 of that to pay my bills, which even by New Orleans standards, coupled with student loans, is certainly not enough. So I was working as a bond attorney in municipal court and criminal court as well, under a contract with the public defender's office. And I was then taking a majority of my income and trying to bring on contractors and other folks to help me figure out what the hell we were doing. And so my mind was all caught up in fundraising, right? Like, if I can't afford any of this, how am I going to do any of this? And now that challenge seems absolutely minor compared to the challenges of operational, doing operational analytics and figuring out, what are we really doing these services efficiently? Add on to that COVID, where we're now taking operations that we were just starting to get perfected and now having to convert them remotely. How do I have an HR department that is resolving staff disputes appropriately and supporting our staff? All of those things were not even on my mind. I thought it was just about raising as much money as possible. And a friend of mine told me this, who also started an organization, said, if you do good work, the money will come. And while I wouldn't co-sign that completely, Echoing Green did an incredible report that showed in really startling terms how hard it is for women of color and men of color to lead nonprofit organizations, and how little money they get in comparison, and how the money they do get has strings attached. So I wouldn't completely say that's a universal truth, but there's truth there, that if you're doing the good work, and the good work is, it has to be done with effective operations, with good HR, the money will come. And so if I had it all to do over, I would have started a lot more quickly with paying attention to what our systems look like. And all through law school, I took my notes except for Professor Dolovich's class when she didn't allow for computers, so I was handwritten. But even my handwritten notes are in the form of flowcharts, and my brain kind of operates that way, where I'm not as good at narrative writing as I am about putting flowcharts together. And so, and those flow charts then are always subject to revision, but it's so helpful to think in that way. And so in the last few months since COVID hit, we started converting everything to flow charts, and then we come together to look and see where you innovate. And it's tough because you have to balance, right? You have to balance a process that's set, so everyone, especially our most vulnerable clients, are getting equal treatment without having to speak up and advocate for themselves, but then also allowing for my clients to improv and to be able to innovate on it. And unfortunately, our funding stream is such that we're not set in everything we do. We have a lot of freedom to innovate and change the way that we do things. So sorry, to answer your question.
Yes. Yeah. It's a very good answer to the question. I'm always interested. I'm a huge believer in mentors and the value of having mentors throughout your career, frankly. So tell us about your mentors. And I assume that you had some, and I assume that they were helpful. And how did you use them? How did you connect with them? How did you keep up with them? And what did you do?
Yeah. This was another thing that got even better during COVID is I have these regular check-ins with people around me. I check in once a week for 2 hours on Saturdays with 4 people from the fellowship program that I was a part of, Echoing Green. They're all founders, some of for-profits and some of nonprofits, and we work together. We meet, and that's huge. Build a space where we can empathize with each other and vent, and also just be friends. But I also made sure that I had a really diverse cross-section of attorneys, or I'm sorry, not of attorneys, of some attorneys, but of one of my biggest mentors is actually a bail bondsman. And I use the term mentorship not in the way that I'm trying to become a bail bondsman, but it would be so naive and offensive to pretend, as he was actually the first Black bail bondsman in Louisiana, that I can't have something to to learn from someone who is who I might have a fundamental disagreement with. I really challenge the efficacy and the ethics of money bail. But I'd have to learn from his perspective, and I also have to learn from someone that has years of more experience of addressing both public safety in New Orleans, as well as corruption in New Orleans and injustice in New Orleans. And I think it's really helpful to balance yourself off of someone who you have a fundamental disagreement. I don't think that if someone denies the humanity of my clients or of myself, I don't think reasonable minds can differ on that front, right? I don't think we can just agree to disagree. And so our relationship is not that way. We agree on quite a bit, but I go to him for a lot of guidance. And sometimes it's that I go to him and I will realize we fundamentally disagree about the path I'm going to take next, but it allowed me to feel stronger in my position about the path I need to take. And that is really helpful as well.
So Kelly, let me interrupt you for a moment. I'm going to go back to mentors, but I'm going to call on faculty privilege here because Professor Dolovich needs to leave soon and she had a question and I want to make sure she was able to ask her question.
Thank you, Joel. And Kelly, thank you so much for being here and doing this. I just want to echo what Joel said. We are so proud of you. I mean, you're doing this remarkable work, and it really, you're one of the people that I hold up when I talk about how amazing and committed and self-starting our students are, especially in the criminal justice space. So thank you for everything you're doing. I have about 1,000 questions I would love to ask you. I just want to ask this one. You've already said some things about how you got started kind of in general terms, but I think, it's hard if you're in the middle of law school, it's hard to conceive, even if you have a good idea of how you go from, let's say, just graduating from law school to operationalizing such an ambitious project. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit in the nuts and bolts way about how you moved from graduating from law school to starting this organization to getting to the point where you have all these colleagues and HR questions and are ramping up quickly. I mean, you're just doing so much in such a short time, and I think people would I'd like to hear, and I know others would like to hear, how did you get there?
Definitely, yeah. Thank you for that question. So actually, I started crafting the organization with my team in New Orleans, Calvin Duncan, Jack DeLosa, Blair Boutte, Norris Henderson, and Ben Smith, who are all formerly incarcerated folks. Calvin Duncan actually is in his first year of law school at Lewis and Clark, which is just incredible. And he is largely responsible for the non-unanimous jury case that made its way to the United States Supreme Court, is making its way back up to the United States Supreme Court for oral argument on November 30th. But so I started in 2014 working with Calvin most closely. And I had known Calvin for about 6 years, and he came home from prison with very little support. And what I quickly learned is that while law school contributed a ton, and my law school classes absolutely contributed a ton to my thinking and certainly my expertise as a lawyer, I needed to go to business school. And so I learned that you can take 6 credits at another school at UCLA, and they'll count towards your law degree. You have to go through an approval process, but you can take up to 6 credits. When I was a student, you could do that. And so I went over to the MBA program, and I picked the class Entrepreneurship and Venture Capitalism. I kind of intentionally avoided classes that were specifically about starting nonprofits because I wanted to be surrounded by folks who knew more about finance than I did, and also knew more about capital and access to capital than I did. And so I took a business plan. There's a 2-part course about business plan development, and I took both sides of it. And I wrote my business plan. I stood up on the first day, as I didn't know you did this in MBA school, and I pitched it kind of quickly. And I got one person that latched onto it. He told me he had left Lehman Brothers, and he said, honestly, I just don't want to go to hell. And I feel like if I work with you, I'm less likely to go to hell than like working with some of these other companies that were less mission driven. I'll never forget Ryan. And so I learned the component parts of a business plan. Like that was to start, because I was totally passion driven, right? I knew this needed to be done. I wanted to do the help, but I knew nothing about how to build the organization. So I learned the component parts of how you need to have a business model. Then you need to have a revenue stream. You need to know what it costs. So you need to be able to make a budget that has both revenue and costs. You need to have a marketing strategy. And you need to have a board of advisors. And I'm not doing justice to exactly what's in a business plan, but those were like those key components. And that became that starting point to say, okay, now what? And then you dig deeper in the second part of the course where you think about diversified revenue bases. And so when I first started it, I was almost wholly funded on pitch competitions. Social entrepreneurship is a big thing is pitch competition. So I had to learn how to explain what my problem was and what my solution to that problem was in less than 60 seconds, combined with why I'm the person to do it. And perhaps most importantly and often disregarded is a really thorough landscape analysis. Sometimes, especially people who go to like really good law schools and are used to being like really good at what they do, we forget that we're not the first people to do just about anything. And so you need to do a thorough landscape analysis and know everything about every single player out there. And I think I'm still pretty good about that. There's rarely will someone say, oh, you know about this, reentry organization in Illinois. And like, if I don't know the answer, I'll definitely know the answer within the next hour because I'm like addicted to making sure I know my landscape analysis. So I learned the landscape analysis. I went around and paid for myself to do site visits at organizations that I thought I had the most to learn from. Inside and outside of the reentry space. And I wrote that business plan that I still continue to reference, although it's pretty outdated at this point. And then I started looking for fellowships that I would be. And as Joel mentioned, he was an incredible sounding board and judge as I did this. So I went around and I applied for postgraduate fellowship programs that would give me the freedom to explore this idea on my own. Because I knew I wouldn't be able to build this if I was working a full-time job for another entity. So I won a few pitch competitions. I got awarded a couple of fellowships. It's sort of laughable at this point. I think I have like 11 fellowships. And I'm very, very fortunate for that. And that has been a huge source of support, both networking as well as funding. And then once I was in those spaces, I took advantage of every technical assistance opportunity that I could. And so once I got the funding and once I had the network of support and the landscape knowledge, then I turned to my team, simultaneously, I turned to my team, and they were just, they're absolute experts, as deep as you can get on Louisiana and on the prison system. And they're deeply connected to, they've done 150 years between them and several facilities at the state and federal level. And so we came together, and the first group of people that we started paying were our reentry coaches. And it was 6 formerly incarcerated men who had all gone through this process as a community. And 2 of them were co-founders of the organization. And we would just start meeting weekly and just start asking ourselves, what do people need? How do we get it? How can we connect them to that? And they focused on more of the operation side of things. And I kind of oversaw that to make sure that we were getting real results. And then I focused on diversifying our rev base and figuring out I can't rely on fellowships forever. So where are the government contracts to do this? Where is the private philanthropy to do this? What is our earned income strategy to do this? And how do I build up an individual donor base? And it just became that fundraiser in chief. And what it required was working a lot. I mean, you have to work so much and such long hours to get this done. But I took every opportunity I could. Any invitation that I got to be in a room with people in power, I would take it. And I got, 500 business cards, and I gave them out to everybody, got the business cards back, and was just talking to anybody that I could to get us on the radar. And then at its core, I'm huge, and I think this is a key to our success. I'm huge on our integrity, that we never overstate what we're able to do, and we never overstate our accomplishments. And we are just fiercely, fiercely candid that reentry is not a fairy tale, and that reentry is really challenging, and that we cannot be judged wholly on the success of our clients staying out of prison because we can't protect them from everything. So I made sure that we always kept our eye on our clients, and it was their success and their happiness and their safety that was our top priority. I would figure out how to deal with our funders and liaison that way. But any time that any one of our staff members started to act abusive towards a client or lose their patience with someone, I recognized that that's both inappropriate, but also a reflection of their overwork. and just keeping that kind of North Star to make sure that that you can never question the credibility and the integrity of the first 72 plus, because it doesn't always come from the Department of Corrections or from our who we think are adversaries. It comes from other nonprofits, which is a part of the scarce resource mentality. And it is challenging, but you have to protect yourself in that way. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, that's fabulous and very helpful. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry I have to leave, but it's lovely to see you, and congratulations on everything you've been doing.
Thank you so much. It was really nice to see you as well. And to that question, I am big on talking with anybody who's willing to pursue this. I didn't talk about like insurance considerations, right? About like occupational licenses and about how to have the right case management system and bookkeeping system, how to prepare for your first audit. And if you have anybody who's considering doing this, I'm happy to talk on like a granular level about what it looks like on a day-to-day basis and how to actualize it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Take care. Thanks for doing this.
I just wanted to mention that of how persuasive Kelly is. I still remember Kelly coming to my office and telling me that the law school needed a course on entrepreneurship. And then a week later, she brought in Professor Abe to meet me because he was going to teach the course. And we've, of course, hired Professor Abe, and he's been teaching the course for 5 years at the law school. So, and I also remember Kelly saying to me, because I asked her, why are you taking all these business classes? And she said, because I need to talk to bankers.
Yes.
Right? I need to be able to understand what they're talking about. Right. So really looking ahead at things. I have two more questions, then we'll sort of open it up, if that's okay, to the audience. One question I have is, do you think you'll ever start a new venture again? Because, one of the hallmarks of many entrepreneurs, whether they're serial entrepreneurs or for-profits, is that it's the part of it is, and I would have to say this is true from this kind of short conversation we've been having, is the thrill, the absolute excitement of doing it, right? I mean, obviously you've accomplished this tremendous thing. You're obviously really proud of it. It was done with tremendous amount of work and blood, sweat, and tears by you and others. But watching you talk about it and listening to you, I thought, oh, well, she would go and do it again, right? In other words, so do you have ideas for doing other things?
That is such a great question. And my fiance has asked me that several times as well. And I never set out to want to found something. I've met people now, especially through Echoing Green, that this is their thing, right? And I met people at business school, like they are entrepreneurs. They're not accountants. They're not marketing specialists. They don't want to be the second CEO to an already existing company. They're founders. And to me, I didn't set out to be a founder. I set out to solve a problem or figure out an answer to a problem. And what I found was there was no available answer. And so I had to create one with my colleagues. And I now do like some contract work with the Tulane, with the school, the entrepreneurship program at Tulane. And one of the first things I challenge students to do is to prove to me that they're creating something so novel that something brand new has to exist, that they can't just innovate in an existing institution or entity or create a new program, or that they have to create something from scratch. And because I think that that's we started our 501c3 from scratch, right? Like I filed the 1023 while I was at UCLA Law School, and every single aspect of it was novel. We didn't take over an existing 501c3, right. And so I've had some interesting opportunities in the last year pop up around developing a clinical program. Because I'm really intrigued by that. But even then, you can't say you're a founder. It's creating a program within a larger, already existing institution. And I'm very attracted to that because, liaisoning with my insurance broker and with our third-party auditors and with our accountant and doing all of that, while certainly would be easier to do again because I know what to look for. I'm not sure that it's what gives me joy. What gives me joy is knowing that this huge problem that I recognize that was impacting people that I love now has an answer. And if I'm confronted with another problem where there is no available answer, and it seems like I might be the best person to answer that problem, I wouldn't turn away from it. I don't think I have it in me to do that. But then also on a practical level, I want to have children. I recently got engaged, and while I certainly think that families can do both, and every family is unique, I've been working 7 days a week for about 16 hours a day for the last 6 years. And that doesn't even count, the law school that I also completed. And it's exhausting. It has taken a toll on my mental health and my physical health. Also, to be really candid about it as well, because of the space that I work in, and working with people who are incredibly vulnerable and systemic racism, I believe, is a thing, despite what the vice presidential incumbent said the other day. Systemic racism is real and it's very violent. And since we started the first 72 plus, we have lost more people to gun violence and preventable disease than we have to recidivism. And those people were my friends. And on 3 occasions, I was with them when they died at the scene. And that has been really challenging for me to deal with. And I'm really fortunate that I have access to healthcare to address that. But I got in, I think, a little over my head with making myself, with letting people depend on me who were very, very, very vulnerable and very much at risk. And so I am glad that I did it, and I'm so grateful for the last 6 years. But I think I'm trying to take a moment to make sure that I don't get burnt out, and also that sort of everything's cool with Kelly. And I would have to check in with my family before I decided to take that on again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my final question. I'm sure we have some students out there who, like you, are in law school thinking about creating their own venture, whether it's for profit or social entrepreneurship or something else, but have it in the back of their mind. Do you have some advice for them, what they should be doing?
Yeah, definitely. So, get the book Business Model Canvas. So one thing I want to say, I push back on this notion of social entrepreneurship because I think it lets the other sector off the hook. We should not be calling ourselves social entrepreneurs. Everyone else should be calling themselves socially irresponsible entrepreneurs. Whether it's for profit or nonprofit, and nonprofits do not have full control over, social justice. Like their social justice is actualized in many different ways. And if we do not consider, if you're starting a business and you're generating revenue or you're receiving revenue and you're employing people, you have a social responsibility to do that well and to do it ethically and to do it socially responsibly. And so I would encourage everyone to make sure you have to know the components of it. You have to know how to navigate within capitalism, and you have to understand how to navigate within the business world, and you need to understand what revenue is, and you need to understand what a budget is and what taxes are and what liability protection is, and what licensing laws are. And so I would encourage everyone to take business classes and to understand that framework at a basic level, and then to also understand what social inequity is, and to understand how we got to where we are and how our system has been designed in this way, and what we as business people who start businesses are if we're doing it well, we're being a little, I think, like we're resisting. We should be resisting how things have been done, and we should be reimagining it so that people are healthy and safe, and that exploitation is not a component part of your business model. And a lot of business models depend on some aspect of exploitation. So I think that to understand critical race theory, and both from a legal standpoint, but then also from also more broadly as it permeates all of our institutions, combined with an understanding about how to keep a business running and profitable so that people get paid and people can pay their bills. So yeah, so business classes, absolutely. So UCLA law students definitely take advantage of going over to the Anderson School and meeting the folks over there. Remember that you are not enough in this, and that also founders think about an exit strategy for yourself when you get it started. I believe founder syndrome is a real thing, and that businesses suffer because people stay in leadership too long. There's a very different thing between, I think, a founder CEO and a CEO, subsequent CEO, and there's real value in bringing someone in who was not the founder, and it's going to make this idea better. So focus on your team first and foremost, and surround yourselves by at least a handful of people that you deeply trust and that share your vision, but are also not hesitant to push back on you. And then I think a landscape analysis. You have got to do landscape analysis to understand what is already existing out there, not just in your immediate field, but in fields that are remotely similar. So we also look at shelters that house survivors of domestic violence. That's really similar. We look at the mental institution context and behavioral health centers as adjacent and very similar fields that we can learn a lot from. We look at worker-owned cooperatives and about cooperative living environments as well to learn from them. We look at police departments and understand how certain alternative models to police departments around the country. Be an expert, get obsessive about the landscape and the other neighbors to what you're trying to do, because that's how you're credible. And people are always going to try to cut you down and try to make you feel as though you don't belong in the space and that you shouldn't be there. And I think the best way I've been able to prove that I belong in this space is I'm not an expert on many things, but I have quite a bit of expertise about the reentry landscape. And I spend a lot of time still today learning about every other organization that's out there so that I can speak confidently. And also, don't think about this space as zero sum. I think there are scarce resources, but a scarce resource mentality is really dangerous. You need to think about making the pie bigger for everyone and not competing in that way. Competition can drive us in some ways. I certainly have done a lot of pitch competitions and beaten people in that process, and that helped. But competition, I think, harms us more than it helps us. We need to think about how we can, rising tides lift all boats, not trying to knock people out of the way.
Great. Well, Kelly, if you have a few more minutes, let me open it up in case some people have questions. If they raise their hand. If we have that here. Do we have that? Because I'm not seeing that. So.
I've never learned how to do that, the whole raising the hand thing.
Well, at a university, you're supposed to be able to do that. Oh, okay. I have one here. Galen, go ahead.
Hi. I found this presentation super awesome. I really admire what you've done. That's awesome. And I just had two questions. One is you talk about the importance of landscape analysis, but how do you do it? Do you just literally Google, or how do you kind of start that process? And I just feel like sometimes it's so overwhelming if you're trying to get a sense of such a broad range of different organizations that are doing kind of adjacent work. And then my other question is you were talking a little bit about kind of educating yourself so that you can work within the existing capitalist system. And I was wondering how you are able to get funding, because I think that there's a lot of problems with certain sources of funding and ending up kind of you were saying beholden to a certain type of idea of what you should be doing with your organization, or taking money from people who maybe don't actually believe in the mission of what you're doing. So how do you kind of navigate those two things?
Great question. So yeah, landscape analysis is Google. If you start just Googling and using your Google search terms to figure out reentry, certain city or transitional housing, you start to learn the buzzwords. And so I had notebooks and different documents that I would keep these different buzzwords that pop up. So within the reentry landscape, emergency transitional housing, workforce development, racial equity, economic empowerment, formerly incarcerated people. There's more pejorative terms like inmate and ex-convict. And and all of these buzzwords as you start to learn them. Sort of like when you're doing legal research on different cases, these are recurring terms, and this is the lingo. Like how I wanted to learn how people with finance backgrounds speak. I needed to learn those buzzwords, because if I was saying, if I was saying something, if I didn't know the word revenue, they were automatically going to know I didn't know what I was talking about. Or if I didn't understand, I was like, my financial documents, no, my profit and loss statement and my balance sheet, right? Like you learn those lingo, and it gives you credibility, and it also guides you through the internet. And then once I paid for myself on a credit card that I only recently paid off, I think, to fly all around the country and do site visits on my own. And I would just cold call and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm a UCLA law student. That, really helped. And I'm interested in learning more about your approach to this. Would you mind if I came in toward your facility? Now I have a little bit more sympathy for doing that, because it takes a lot of time for people out of their day. So if I had it to do over, I would have offered to pay. Like I would have said, could I pay $50, to make a $50 donation and tour your facility for a day or something like that, to give them some income for that. And then I would just ask, I say, who else do you think I should be talking to? Who else do you think is doing this well? Who have you learned from? And I just have notebooks and notebooks and notebooks full of notes about different places that I went to. And I visited places that I had a reputation of not being so great, but I wanted to learn what they were doing. And I got stranded actually in Long Island once, when a cop realized that I was not totally on board with what he was doing. And he literally left me he took me to a community center and made a really sexist joke to somebody, and I didn't laugh, and he saw my face, and the next thing I knew, he had left, and I had to figure out a way to get from Long Island back to Manhattan. So you gotta be kind of careful when you're kind of crossing lines, but yeah, I did. And it was on Google is still, if I had a law firm or a consulting firm, it would be Kelly Googles it and Associates, because it's just, it's so effective. I still don't have a subscription to Lexis or Westlaw. I have to use my interns and my law clerk's credentials. Don't tell anybody that. So that, to answer your first question on landscape analysis, the other question is interesting. And I agree. I feel my colleagues who are like, I'm not going to take money to that source. I understand it. I usually push back, and I'm like, in America, in the world, in capitalism, all the money is covered in blood. It's all problematic. It was all, I don't know where you're trying to add this hierarchy. The Rockefeller Foundation, remember Rockefeller drug laws? You're going to take it from, you'll take it from Rockefeller, but you won't take it from Walmart. This sort of moral hierarchy, I think, can get a little dangerous, because I have interesting conversations with friends about this. But then also on a practical level, very rarely, and it's never happened to us. And one of our first funders was Walmart. And also we're funded partially by a foundation started by the Koch brothers. And to be fair, our relationship with Stand Together has been one of the best in terms of helping me think like a business owner. And yet I have colleagues who wouldn't even talk to me anymore, because they felt as though I had gone to the dark side and was totally corrupted. And we'll have that conversation. But when I signed for that money, just like when I signed for the Walmart money, at no part in that contract did it say I could not advocate for a living wage, that I could not, that we had to constrain our communication strategy, that we couldn't ever say anything bad about Walmart, that we couldn't talk about environmental justice or the dangers of oil production. There was no restriction. And for an organization at our level, they don't care. We don't have enough power to really add such bad press. And conversely, they never asked us to promote them. They are never make sure that you say that Walmart is your best friend and Walmart made all of this possible for you. They'll ask you to put their logo, and it becomes something that you as a team need to decide what you're going to do. But I have, in the 6 years, and it's just 6 years, we've taken money from a lot of different places and have had divergent political ideologies, and have not suffered or had our mission. And I I have had on a couple of occasions, I've had some judges, we have a court contract, and some judges have ridiculed some of my social media posts. And I've pushed back and said, has anything about what I've said, is it untrue? Is any of this untrue? Is it untrue that our district attorney's office has jailed victims of domestic violence, or has issued fake subpoenas, or has put innocent people on death row? Is that untrue? And they're like, no, but it makes them mad at us. And I said, if we're, one way that we maintain our credibility is we speak the truth on this. And so it's something you really should have at the forefront of your mind, but I think we got to get a little more creative. And also one time we had a representative from the Trump administration come and visit our organization. And that was the most challenging thing we faced, actually. And half of the staff, we gave them the option that only people that wanted to be there could be there, and nobody was forced to be there, and no one would have their pay docked or anything. And about 6 of our colleagues chose not to come to work that day. And the other members came. I, as the executive director, felt like I had a responsibility to be there because my board asked me, although I did wrestle with it, but I showed up and I represented the organization. And I'm not saying it was the right answer, but I think we have an open and honest relationship with our colleagues where we engage on it. And I think it needs to be an ever evolving conversation. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Corbin.
Hey, thanks for being here. And I apologize if you had said it before, but when you got the Echoing Green Fellowship, I know a lot of those postgraduate fellowships, particularly in the criminal legal advocacy realm, like Soros, Equal Justice Works, whatever, they oftentimes want you to have a partner organization because you are starting as a, brand new attorney. Did you have to go through that, particularly with Echoing Green, or your just general thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I hadn't really touched on that. And so Echoing Green is unique in that they want you to be wholly brand new. So you can't be fiscally sponsored, which is like the technical term on that. You can't have a fiscal sponsor. You have to start from scratch. Which I go back and thought about whether that was a good decision for us. One thing to throw out there for nonprofit entrepreneurs in this space is there are these organizations that are known as professional fiscal sponsor organizations. There's one, the best one is based in California. It's called Social and Environmental Entrepreneurs. And they do all the stuff that none of us got into this to do. Like maybe I could be wrong, but I've never met an entrepreneur that was like, I am just so passionate about accounting. I just want to start an organization that just so I can do nothing but accounting all day, right? Like nobody starts out with that mission. So Social and Environmental Entrepreneurs does all that for about, it depends on your budget, but it's like 6.5% to 12% of your budget annually they take, of your revenue annually they take. They do your audit, they do your HR, they do all of your bookkeeping, they manage your insurance policies, and they indemnify you on several other things. And so that I kind of wish we had done instead, because I went the and entrepreneurship awards, I had to create something from scratch. And actually what ended up happening is I created and was running 2 organizations at the same time. One was called Rising Foundation, economic empowerment side. That was Incubator, our home ownership program, and our loan funds. And the other was the First 72 Plus, which is all our initial stabilization services. The First 72 Plus was fiscally sponsored by a Baptist church. And which it was started by my colleague, Pastor Tyrone Smith, has history back to the civil rights movement in the Deep South. I am pretty agnostic, and my colleagues tolerate me for that. A lot of my colleagues are pretty devoutly Baptist or Muslim, and are very, their faith is a huge part of their identity. And so they've just learned to live with the fact that I am just one of those West Coast liberal atheists that but that has respect, but not an identity in that space. And so on a practical level, what that meant, though, was some people will not fund 501c3 religious organizations because another class that you should take, Tammy Bryant's tax-exempt organizations, is a really helpful course. 501c3 religious organizations are protected by the First Amendment and cannot be audited, and they don't have to file taxes. And so can't paint with a broad brushstroke. There are a lot of very, very, very legit 501c3s that are not just black holes of money and not just totally embezzling it. Very fun cases that you read about those that do not go in that direction. But some funders will not do it because 501c3 religious organizations have those protections. And so we very quickly had to leave that for 72 plus, merge with Rising Foundations, and we're straight at 501c3. And I think that's that core question. Because either, and as Joel asked me, like, am I ever going to do this again? Like, I didn't start out to do it. I didn't set out to be a founder. I set out to solve a problem. And had I been able to partner with an organization or join an already existing organization and implement the solution that I knew needed to be implemented, the responsible thing would have been to do that. Whereas someone who just wants to start something from scratch, then they're more driven by their desire to be a founder. They're not necessarily as much driven by the problem they wish to solve, because I think rarely do you need to start something from scratch, and rarely is it the best thing that you can do.
So Kelly,
Answer your question.
Yes, thank you.
Kelly, thank you very much. We're kind of out of time. I have to say this is one of the best conversations that I've had, and it would be true whether we were on Zoom or live. And I hope in the future that we can actually fly you out to campus on Lowell Milken Institute money, and you can come and talk to our students live, and then do some fundraising out on the West Coast as well. So I'm looking forward to that. And I also recommend that you go to First 72 Plus to their website. We sent around a couple of their YouTube videos as an introduction, but it's a terrific website, has a lot going on it, including an opportunity to donate if you have a few spare coins. So Kelly, thank you very much. I'm sorry, Zoom is terrible with applause, but I think if you had been at UCLA Law School, this would have been a standing ovation because it was really
thank
excellent.
you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming and watch. We have our next one is up in November, and we're looking forward to seeing you all again. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you all so much.
All right.